So, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about the challenges of what's happening right now to really acknowledge and validate the experiences of many ADHD women right now with what's going on in the world, particularly with the United States administration. And we're going to dig into how our brains tend to be highly sensitive and more easily overwhelmed by our emotion and external experiences. And later in the podcast, we're going to explore what to do to effectively navigate these challenging experiences triggered by world events, especially if you're in the US right now and seeing some of the dismantling of many human rights that have been around for decades. So, this is important because without this piece, as ADHDers, we may end up more chronically in our protective responses of either fight or flight or shutdown, making it nearly impossible to focus and get stuff done with ADHD. By the end of our time together, you will likely feel seen and validated in your experiences and walk away with three essential practices to help you navigate the world at this time. Be sure to listen. Welcome to the Self-Loved ADHD Woman's Way podcast. I'm your host, Jen Barnes. If you're an ADHD woman entrepreneur, ADHD adjacent, or ADHD-ish, you've come to the right place. We'll dive deep into the unique challenges you face, from the inner turmoil to the outer obstacles. We'll blend neuroscience, IFS, and somatic healing and explore practical strategies to help you navigate the world of entrepreneurship with ADHD with greater ease and effectiveness. I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. This is an important conversation and is not going to be for everybody. And I went back and forth on whether or not we should dig into this, but I'm seeing so many women with ADHD struggling right now with what's going on in the United States, what's going on around the world. And it feels like, as a social worker, I need to speak to that. And so if right now you're in a place of celebrating what's happening and you're not necessarily upset by some of the rapid attempts at taking away people's rights, then this episode isn't for you. I really just want to create a space for people who are really struggling with right now. And this is going to be a very nuanced conversation about a lot of complex topics, and this isn't a place for black and white thinking or arguing. I want this to be a safe space to do some inner exploration and also for you to receive some tools for coping right now, some practices, some things to do in this moment. So I want to start with that. And also, we're going to start a little bit differently than we ever have. I'm actually going to start with a nervous system regulation exercise. I've never done this before. I normally don't. These are normally only things you can get in my paid programming. And because we're going to be talking about some complex things, having nuanced conversation, it's really important that we do this from a regulated place. So I'm going to invite you to do a meditative movement with me. Meditative movements were developed by Ellie Peterson in Chanhassen, Minnesota. They were studied at the University of Minnesota in 2017 and found to decrease anxiety, depression, and improve overall well-being, emotional well-being. And so there's different meditative movements for different things. The one that we're going to practice today is I am safe. And with meditative movements, there's always a movement. Then we do the movement and the breath. Then we do the movement, the breath, and the affirmation. The affirmation, like I said, is I am safe. And if those words don't feel accurate for you, if you're someone who's maybe never felt safe or aren't feeling safe right now, as long as it's safe enough to do so, like if you actively are being harmed in this moment, this is not the time for this, but if you're safe enough to regulate your nervous system, but the words I am safe don't match your experience ever in your life right now, then you might choose the affirmation, may I be safe. Okay. So there's a couple ways to teach the hand movements in this. I'm just going to do one to simplify since we're on a podcast. So you're welcome to place one hand on your heart and your other hand on your belly. And then go ahead and switch hands. And then switch hands again and switch your hands one more time. Now, take a full breath in, switching your hands. And as you exhale, hold. As you're switching your hands, take a full breath in and exhale, hold. Do that 2 more times. Breathe in and switch. Breathe out and hold. Last time, breathe in and switch. Breathe out and hold. Now we'll add the affirmation 4 times on the exhale. Inhale, breathe in, switch. And as you exhale and hold, say, I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. Inhale, fully switch. Exhale, I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. Inhale, fully switch. Exhale, I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. Inhale, fully switch. Last time. Exhale, I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. I am safe. And you're welcome to release your hands, perhaps placing them in your lap. And you might just pause for a moment and notice how you feel. Yeah, and so you're welcome to practice that daily. I recommend it for sure daily, and then it is something you could do in a moment if you feel dysregulated and would like to regulate. It involves movement with breath, so it can help you regulate both from the shutdown response and the fight or flight response. Though I will say sometimes in your fight or flight response, you may not have access to the inner wherewithal to do that specific regulation tool, but it's something you can experiment with. So, first, as we get started, I just want to acknowledge what's going on and why I would even talk about this on a podcast for ADHD women entrepreneurs. So, I want to start by saying that with ADHD, many of us, not all, tend to have a higher level of sensitivity and a high sense of social justice. And the social justice piece could be because of our high sensitivity. It could be because we feel things deeply. People with ADHD don't necessarily have more or less empathy. There are some people with ADHD who have high empathy, others who have low. But because we feel things deeply, and perhaps because we know what it's like to be different and have our differences not celebrated or even really allowed in society without challenges, that when we see people who are also different than the people making the laws suffering, we feel deeply for them. And it might be any of those things, it might be none of those things. But when we see some of the executive orders coming through, and I'm not going to unpack all this because I don't want to trigger us after we just did that nice exercise, or we see the fires in California or Hurricane Helene earlier in the year and people still recovering so many months later, or we see what's going on in Gaza, Palestine, or even Ukraine, which has been the war has been going on a long time, and just all the stuff, right? a lot of us feel very deeply. And so then this can end up dysregulating us. And it's okay to feel deeply. It's human to feel very deeply. And our brains tend to be stickier. We tend to hold on to stuff longer. And it can make it really hard for us to function. Whatever it is that's behind the challenges, the extra challenges we may experience around things not going well for people who are different from the people making the rules and the laws. I'm noticing two main responses right now with a lot of my ADHD folks, and even in myself. One is avoidance and numbing, like just not paying attention to what's happening, not looking at the news, not going on social media. And don't get me wrong, that's a strategy I often recommend when people feel overwhelmed. So I'm not suggesting that those are bad things, but the numbing to a point of making it hard to do anything. I also am noticing a lot of overwhelm and anxiety and people being really scared and in fear. And I totally get it because what's happening right now is really scary. It's really scary to see some of the ways the new administration came out and immediately was trying to take away rights from people who are different from them. And that, of course, is going to trigger our survival responses, especially if we're part of one of those groups, but even if we're not. Because, like I said, a lot of us have very deep compassion for others who are different from the people making the rules and laws. And so it impacts us too. And when we are in those survival responses, we aren't able to get ourselves to do the advocacy work we need to do for ourselves and the causes we care about. And like I've said, we're not able, or it's even harder than normal with ADHD, to be able to direct our attention, sustain our focus, feel motivated to start and complete things, especially the uninteresting things that we have to do, so that we want to be able to find a way to work through this stuff so we can be functional during this time and be able to advocate if we so choose. And I just want to say, in some ways, when we look at the way the incoming administration did what they did, in a lot of ways, it appears this was done very intentionally. They came out with so many hits to so many different areas that it overwhelms our nervous systems, those of us who care about people different from us. It's it's overwhelming to see all of it. I made the mistake on inauguration day of going on NPR, and I love NPR, but like looking at everything, I thought I was just going to see how bad it was. It was way worse than I thought. And it was overwhelming to see story after story about the dismantling of protections in our country that have been around for decades. And I, I, I can only believe that they want us scared, because when we're scared, we can't advocate for change. And I want to back up and talk a little bit about how this makes sense when we consider what seems to be beneath the behavior that we're witnessing. And for many, what it looks like is fear and unresolved wounds and trauma. And that may sound like a weird thing to say when these people in power are in power and they're doing all this stuff. But as a trauma therapist, I've seen a lot of people in fear do a lot of scary things. And as Brene Brown says, a lot of people act scary when they're scared, because when we're afraid, different doesn't feel safe. Right? How many of us, if you're in my boat with things where you're like, oh my gosh, all these people voted for someone who's doing this. I don't know if I feel safe around others. Like, how do I know who voted against my rights? I heard that a lot. I even felt that a little bit at first after the election. And so how many of us, when we're afraid, feel that something different from us is unsafe? It's not just them. We do too, right? And when we are afraid, uncertainty also feels unsafe. And lack of control feels unsafe. So when you consider that people who feel unsafe tend to try and control things and what I see as a trauma therapist, a lot of control for external environment, and right? And if you have a history of trauma, you know what I'm talking about. Or if you know someone with a history of trauma, there's a lot of attempts to control the external world, especially before any healing has been done. I certainly know I did a lot of that until I started really doing some deeper healing work. I would try and control my external environment. And I'm not saying we don't advocate for ourselves and try and have accommodations in an environment that doesn't support people with ADHD. That's not what I'm talking about here. But there can be, when we're afraid, there can be a lot of trying to control the external environment to make it feel more safe for us. And I believe that's what we're witnessing. People who aren't scared, people who feel regulated and safe, don't need to have power over. They can connect with their inner power and be able to lead from that place, to lead from a place of curiosity and compassion. So, what I believe we are witnessing is a lot of people, including the one in the president, who really are in a lot of fear. And why is that important? It's like, I don't care what they're going through. They're scaring the hell out of me. Here's the thing, okay? It's important to understand because when we understand it, it can feel less scary, right? Because uncertainty is terrifying when we're afraid. It feels very unsafe. So, what I will say, and this is going to sound radical to say, but I'm a social worker. I've been in the field for 25 years now, though I will say I couldn't officially call myself a social worker till I got my master's, which was 2005. But I've been working in the field of mental health for a very long time. And I've worked in all kinds of settings. I've worked in a halfway house. I did case management, including working closely with child protection, though I was more in a children's mental health role. I've worked in schools. I've worked with military. I've worked with people in community mental health centers. I've been in private practice. So I've had exposure to a lot of people from different walks of life. And of course, as someone who does this work, I'm very curious about how people do things. So I'm always paying attention. And what I've noticed in all of the work I've done is that, with the exception of true sociopaths and psychopaths, every single person I've worked with, and I've only worked with one sociopath, every single other person, even people who did really bad things, truly got up every day and did the damn best they knew how with the inner and outer resources they had, given their circumstances. That's a nuanced thing to have, like, that's very hard to accept, but I've seen it. And I've seen people who've done some really horrible things. And I can say without a doubt that I know they were doing their best in that moment. And I don't think I'm being naive. There are definitely people who don't do that. And it tends to not be, it tends to be people who are sociopaths and psychopaths. Even narcissists, I will say, really, because a lot of times narcissists are very afraid. They have very low self-worth. And so they are coming from a place of intense inner fear of rejection. And they are doing the best they know how. I think that doesn't mean these people don't need to have consequences when they do awful things. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is most people are doing their best with the circumstances they have and the resources they have. And so when we look at some of the people in charge right now, which is scary to say in charge, but it's true, um, a lot of them have horrible histories that, of course, they're scared. After the 2016 election, I made myself, when Trump's niece wrote a book about him, a biography about him, I made myself read it because I did a lot of work after that election because I had so many people flooding into my practice who were just traumatized. Their own trauma was triggered. They were having a really hard time. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm the therapist. I've got to figure some stuff out for myself so that I'm able to be actually helpful, not just making the problem worse. So I did a lot of deep inner work and a lot of, I wouldn't call it, I mean, kind of studying. I did a lot of reading, listened to a lot of podcasts that were very much about what do we do. And one of the things I noticed is I was experiencing some hatred and even doing some otherizing around Trump and people who followed him at that time. And what I realized is that's not aligned with my values, and that hate and otherizing doesn't really do anything productive. It sure as heck doesn't make the world a safer place when we otherize. I mean, we saw in Nazi Germany what happened when we otherized, right? I think you know what I'm getting at. But the other thing is, all it did was create bitterness in my heart and made me more afraid. When in reality, I was relatively safe. Yeah, there were some things that weren't ideal, but generally speaking, I was relatively safe. And when we're afraid, like I said before, we're limited in our capacity to take action, to advocate. And so I knew that for me to enjoy my life, for me to not be hovering in fear all the time, and for me to be productive and be able to help people and perhaps even advocate, I needed to get to a place of nervous system regulation, and I needed to get to a place of compassion and understanding. That doesn't mean that I also don't have anger about some of the behavior, or I don't think that people who have committed the crimes that some of these people have committed shouldn't be in jail, because they should be. Their compassion doesn't mean there's no accountability. I want to be very clear about that. But by reading that book, I came to understand that he is exactly who he was raised to be. And I don't want to unpack the whole book here. That's not what the point of this podcast is, but that helped me have compassion for him, not without a desire for severe accountability because it's called for. But I was able to have compassion and understand why he was where he was. And he just wants to be loved. He wanted to be loved by his father, who he was probably a sociopath, what it looks like. I can't say anything about someone I haven't met for sure, but um, he had this deep desire to be loved and was afraid of being rejected because he witnessed what happened with his older brother when he was rejected and not loved, and it was painful to watch. So he was like, that's not going to be me. And now we have decades of that. And this is how one, after decades of being too afraid to do what they want to do, so needing to do what others need them to do so that they can feel loved and liked and cared for and get their needs met. And I'm not saying any of this is okay, by the way, but I understand it. And what that understanding and compassion does is it frees my heart. It makes my heart be lighter because now I'm not burdened with his stuff. I realize that it's a function of what he went through. And when you think about our country, I mean, really the world for the past, I don't know, 5,000 years since the patriarchy started in 3000 BC, that's when war started. When the patriarchy came on board is when war started. It was when there was a shift in from a place of understanding the importance of community and compassion for all beings and acceptance of all beings and love and supporting each other, to a place of fear and rugged independence and men not being allowed to feel feelings except anger. And the patriarchy affects men too. And so since that time, we've had all these wars and all this unresolved trauma from those wars that then has gone into households and educational environments and even certain churches where there is a break from the message of the initial person they were following, which may be Jesus in a lot of cases, where there's so much fear that it's about like, oh my gosh, we have to control this, rather than really understanding the message of the person they were following in the first place. And again, this all comes from unresolved wounds and fear. And one of the things I'll say about fear, and I grew up Catholic and I can speak to this, when we are afraid, the church I grew up in, the school, Catholic school I went to, was very fear-based. And I'm going to tell you from personal experience, not just my own, but witnessing in others, fear-based upbringing does something. One of the things it does is it kills compassion for people different than you, and it kills curiosity. And here's the thing that's good about that for certain religions that maybe have no longer aligned with Christ's message and instead are in a place of fear. Not that I'm speaking on Christ's message. I'm not by no means a religious person at all, but it felt malaligned from what I read growing up. The thing is, when people are afraid, when they lose their curiosity and compassion, they're easy to make followers. They don't think for themselves. They don't have the curiosity and creativity to problem solve and think for themselves and decide, does this make sense or are we kind of malaligned here? Instead, they're like, help me, someone. And they're more likely to follow what someone who steps into a quote unquote leadership role says. So isn't that what we're seeing now? I'm not just talking about some of the churches, but in our country, is people are scared. Their curiosity was stolen, their compassion was stolen. There's a lot of otherizing going on so that people different from you are bad and scary and weird. And so that's how we got here. And so to get out of this, we can lead the way by developing and working on our own compassion and empathy, having understanding for how people got there. That doesn't mean we like what they're doing. We can still be concerned about what they're doing and think it's not okay. We can think they need to have accountability, maybe be in prison for some of the horrible things they're doing. But that doesn't mean we can't have compassion and understanding, because then that frees up our hearts. It frees us up to be able to do what we need to do, both for our own lives, for our loved ones, for our business, but also perhaps to advocate for the causes we care about, to advocate for ourselves, and even to help the world. And if you're like, shit, girl, that is too much. I am feeling victimized by these people, and you expect me to have compassion. Let me be clear. This is not for everyone. Not everyone is in a place to do that layer of the work at this time. And I get that, which is why I also want to share 3 practices that can help where you might be right now. And I also want to say, this is a very complex issue. This isn't a black and white thing, like they're all bad and we're only good. All of a sudden, I'm hearing Sirius Black from Harry Potter in my head. We all have light and dark in us, Harry, right? We all do. And it's what we choose to focus on. And if we allow the fear and maybe even hatred to overtake us, then we're turning to the darkness. And isn't that what they want? Because then we're easy to control. We're easy to manipulate. We're easy to turn into followers who just give up and are like, whatever. Whereas if we can do some of this work and get ourselves to a place of at least nervous system regulation, if not compassion, then we have greater access to our inner light, to our highest self, where we can creatively problem solve and courageously advocate in this moment. So, like I said, this isn't necessarily for all people. So, I also want to say this is a process, right? It wasn't in one day that I all of a sudden went from that level of anger and hatred and fear I was experiencing to having this compassion. This has been a practice over the past, 2016, 9 years. So it's a practice, but I find it's been one worth undertaking. But again, if you're just like, no, Jen, this is crazy. I can't do that right now. What are you even talking about? Here's the 3 essential practices that I think are essential right now for not just surviving what's going on, but perhaps even doing more than just making it through. So, number 1, I want to talk about locus of control. There is only so much we can control right now. You can control your own life, and that's about it. You can use your voice to advocate and speak out. But when you really think about your locus of control, what do you have control over? Do you have control over, and if you want to shrink it down, do you have control in the next 5 minutes over what the administration does? No. Do you have control over that in the next 30 days? One of my clients was telling me that their child's therapist was saying this. And I was like, oh, yeah, I forgot about that. That's an awesome skill that I totally forgot. But do you have control in the next 30 minutes? Do you have control in the next hour? Do you have control in the next 24 hours? Do you have control in the next 6 months? And if the answer is no, then it's time to shift your focus. Now, my caveat to that is there is a way to have a voice right now. But if you are not someone who has the wherewithal in this moment to advocate, to speak out, then right now, I recommend limiting your exposure to what's happening, or at least only getting it from sources that are more neutral and fact based, which means not news networks. NPR is probably the most neutral, but even they have a little bit of a tilt. So if you feel a need to be informed, which you may need to choose not to be informed, to that balance between being informed and sanity. But if you choose to be informed, I recommend a newsletter called 1440. You get it in your email box, and they just tell you the top 3 stories to be aware of right now, and they just give you the facts. So it's actually not that long. And they do add some extra things that are kind of interesting sometimes. Some of those are maybe a little less, I don't know. I don't know that those are leaning one way or the other, but those other stories that they create are very fact-based and succinct. And so that's a great way to know what's going on without the story after story of all the drama that's happening. The other person that I recommend following, especially if you're on social media, but she has a newsletter, but I haven't gotten anything recently. So at any rate, is Heather Cox Richardson. She's a historian who Brene Brown interviewed, and she shares the facts of where we're at. Now, it's a lot sometimes to read because it's very clear where we're headed, and she knows because she's a historian. So sometimes that even can be overwhelming for my nervous system. I'm like, not today. But she's another good source to follow because she's coming at it from a historical lens and very fact based about what is happening, not a lot of drama. Something that might give you a little bit more capacity to act is Democracy Forward. You can subscribe to their email list and they actually share actionable steps. I'll get a little bit more onto that when I get to step 3, but what I'm recommending in step 1 is considering your locus of control. What can you control? How much action do you plan to take? If you don't plan to take any action, if you don't plan to have any courageous conversations about the situation, and all you're going to do is sit with the awfulness of it, maybe the news isn't your thing right now. If you also want to be regulated enough to function in life and in your business, just something to consider because it's just like, okay, great. Or maybe pay more attention to local news. I remember I listened to, I think it was Krista Tippett on her On Being podcast, interviewed Ezra Klein, who was the creator of Vox News, Vox with a V, which is very left leaning, but he wrote a book called Why We're Polarized. And so it was fascinating to hear that interview about how we got to this place of a very divided left and right, which was actually very intentional, by the way. And scary how long they've been planning for this moment. But anyway, one of the things that he said is that we have the capacity to influence our local government at about 90% of our locus of control is local government, 10% federal. Like we can influence 10% of what goes on the federal level. However, most people consume their news the opposite of that. They engage with 90% federal news and only 10% local. But our locus of control is local. So pay attention to what's going on locally. That might be where you have your biggest impact. Pay attention to the school board in your district. Go to the PTA meetings. Pay attention to those kind of things if you have a kid. Obviously, I don't have a kid, so I'm not going to a PTA meeting, but locally is where you have control to stand up. And so pay attention to that. If you're going to watch the news, if you're going to take in information, pay attention to what's going on locally because that's where you can actually instill change. Number 2, regulate your nervous system. I say this for 2 reasons. 1, I want you to be able to function in your life. And if we've already talked about here and in many other podcast episodes and YouTube things and everywhere in my world, when your nervous system is dysregulated, ADHD or not, your only priority is survival. So being able to do much of anything else is just going to be even harder, maybe even impossible. And it's just going to be even harder with ADHD. So find ways to regulate your nervous system. I started our podcast today with the meditative movement, I Am Safe. That's a great one to do daily. There's other ways to regulate your nervous system in the moment. You've heard me talk about volcano breathing before, which we're not going to do here, but I've talked about it in other episodes. Find ways to regulate your nervous system. As part of this, When you are facing chronic stress in your life, and if you're like me and you've at all paid attention to what's going on in our country and the world, this could be considered a time of chronic stress. It is important. Actually, it's crucial to complete the stress response every day. You've heard me talk about that, but basically, what it is you're using up the energy that your body has created to fight or flee, but you haven't fought or fleed. So it's finding a way to use up that energy so it doesn't get stuck in your body and create long term health problems or short term other problems, including burnout, including illness, including irritability, whatever. So there's lots and lots of ways you can complete the stress response. I'm going to tell you right now, there's 7 ways I teach. The one that's working for me the best right now is 30 minutes of movement or exercise. It is only after my 30 minutes. Well, I do more than 30 minutes, but I noticed today I was doing Zumba and I was like, Ayola, exhale. And I looked at how long I've been working out and it was 33 minutes. And I was like, oh, that checks out, right? So at least 30 minutes of movement a day. It doesn't have to be consecutive. I found it helpful to be consecutive, but that doesn't have to be. You can go for 3 10-minute walks in your day with your dog, without your dog, if you don't have a dog, walk the neighbor's dog. Well, be careful with that though, because you don't know if they're good on a leash or around other dogs. Anyway, but do something to move your body and release that stress every day. And if you're not in an able body and you cannot do that, do some breathing techniques. That's another really great way. You can, on my YouTube channel, I have some very old YouTube videos that I called Yoga Breaks, was basically trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga modified for a public endeavor like that. You can do those. And some of the movements might be bigger than you can handle, but maybe even just do the first 5 minutes where the movements are basically moving your head and shoulders. So move your body. It's important more now than ever to help regulate your nervous system, to help complete the stress response. Number 3, pick only 1 or 2 causes that you are going to track and then advocate for. Right now, they are intentionally bombarding us with all this stuff, so it makes it impossible to keep track, and it keeps us scattered, and it keeps us with lots of breadth but not much depth, which means we can't really do much. So pick 1 or 2 causes that are important to you. Other people will advocate for the causes that are important to us. I once had a client who, I don't know, she came across this somewhere, but she talked about advocacy is like an orchestra, right? Like when you're in an orchestra, say you're in the clarinet section, there's a time when you need to take a breath. The good news is the music keeps going because not clarinetist needs to breathe at the same time. So when you are taking your breath, when you are focused on one cause, other quote unquote clarinets can focus on their cause or 2 causes, right? That will allow you to stay more regulated in your nervous system and actually be able to take more depth and do something actually effective. If you're wondering, how do I even do something effective? I've never done anything. Well, listen, as a social worker, I've got some ways to tell you. Actually, interestingly, in our NASW, our National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics, we are actually meant to fight for social justice. It's part of being a social worker. So I feel sharing this message is very much in alignment with my professional ethics. So here's what I'll share. The ways I have found easiest to be able to do something is number 1, ResistBot. So go to the ResistBot website. You can Google it or search on it, whatever, if you don't like Google, but you can search on the word ResistBot and the website will come up. And you can sign up so that they have your address. That way, when you text the number they give you, it's like one of those 5-digit numbers. You text the word resist, it will ask you who you want to contact today, and they already know your representatives because they have your address. You can indicate what topic you want to talk about, and then you can choose to send a fax or an email. They may even have another option now. I can't remember. But what I do for the script, so I don't have to write it all out myself, certainly you could use like ChatGPT or something if you trust that. But I will go to 5 Calls, which is another app, and I want to just prepare you. It is very liberal. It's very right leaning, which is okay for me. But for people who maybe are more left center or even like you're right center, but you're seeing what's happening and you're not okay with it, you may choose to adjust some of their language, but it gives you an idea of what you might be able to say. Now, 5 calls is actually an app meant for you to read that script when you call your representative. So that's another option for action. It just gives you a script. By the way, I've called. They don't care. It's not, they don't care how you sound, is what I mean. Like they care about your call because they tally what people call about and what's important so that then they tell the representative. But this is just staffers. This is not, you're not actually going to talk to the US senator or US House rep in your district. You're going to talk to one of their staffers. And they know that you're doing this. They know why you're calling. They just listen and they tally what you said. They often will ask for your address or at least your zip code so they know if you are someone who lives in the area or just someone who's advocating to this particular senator or representative, I should say. So they're not concerned about your wording or if you stumble or if you sound unintelligent in some moment, or they don't care. They're just there to listen and tally what comes through so they can communicate that to the person they work for. So 5 calls is great. Like I said, it's hyper liberal, but what I'll do is I'll copy and paste what they say into my resist bot text, and then I modify it to be like good for a fax or an email and have the words I want and maybe add a personal story if that feels appropriate. So that is a way that you can start to contact your representatives and be active politically if you never have. It's a nice low bar to be able to do it that way. Also, I will tell you, certainly protests and marches are great, but I'm not in any way telling anyone they have to go to a UU. And what I will say is, I have been going to a Unitarian Universalist community. Technically, it's a church. I don't really do well with that word in my life right now. I'm still healing some religious stuff growing up in the Catholic Church. And I go there, and there are like minded people who care about people different from them, who care about trans rights, who care about gay rights, who care about gay marriage, who care about Black people, who care about housing justice, climate justice, all of those kind of things. And you don't have to, there's no creed at a UU. No one believes the same thing there. You get to have your own faith system that you believe in. And we just come together with all our diverse beliefs with a common goal of coming from a place of love and a system of values that includes things like justice and equity and pluralism and transformation. And I'm forgetting a couple of them. There's the initials is JETPIG. So justice, equity, transformation, pluralism. I can't remember I think the final one is generosity. I can't remember the I, but that's basically the base of those communities. Each one is different because we're all, whoever attends, whoever is members makes the decisions about how that particular community operates. But it's something to check out because it's a nice space right now, and it might just help you be in community in a way that you're around like-minded folks. No way telling you have to do that, but that's just an option I wanted to share because I'm finding a lot of support in my community like that. So, okay. We've been through a lot. We started with what we're going through and naming why this is hard for people with ADHD, maybe even harder. We've talked about what is actually going on and how a lot of this is coming from people's unhealed fear and trauma, like the power over. And when we understand that, that frees us up from the victim mindset to have compassion and empathy, and then not without accountability, but then be able to feel more safe in our own nervous system and be able to act. Then we also talked about 3 crucial practices or things you can be doing right now to help yourself navigate these painful times. I wish I could say unprecedented. Unfortunately, this is looking very familiar to other times that were very dangerous in our world's history. So hopefully this helps give you some ideas. And I would love to hear your comments. This is a tough conversation. I have gone back and forth for, oh my gosh, at least a year on whether or not I should bring this into my business because I I I don't want to otherize. And that doesn't mean I don't want to only not otherize people who are gay or black or whatever. Obviously, I don't want to otherize them. I'm a social worker. I value social justice and connection and understanding we're all connected on a deep level. And that their pain is my pain is their pain. And I really believe that we're all connected that way. And that's not the only reason I care about other humans, but I understand that we're all connected and it's important that we do care. And also, I don't want to otherize people who may have voted for him. And I know that sounds crazy because it's like, "What? They did this to us." And I just wanna say what we're hearing, if you're at all on TikTok or other places, when you talk to people who voted for him, I don't most of them didn't understand that this would be what would happen. Some did. Some did. And again, if we lean in and get curious, a lot of them are scared of something different. They don't a lot of people are from small towns, so they haven't been exposed to many people of color, Black folks, or they haven't been exposed to a transgender person. They don't understand that they're just people like you and me who just wanna love, who just wanna be who they are from deep within. And so when people don't have exposure, they fear what they don't know, and then they see someone who's willing to ostracize what they fear, and that feels safe. And I'm not saying it's okay. You can be angry about it. But again, when we even otherize them, we're furthering the problem. So, all right. Very complex conversation, not into the black and white here. So, hopefully, I'll still have listeners tomorrow. I hope this was helpful for you. Feel free to comment and share. I'm not interested in trolls. I'm going to find a way to just ignore you or delete you because that's not what we're about here. We're about courageous conversations. And I hope that you got something that you needed to hear today. So, also, I want to say if you're interested in like regulating your nervous system, I have a challenge I've been doing monthly. And in the month of March, we're going to switch to my new platform, which is really awesome for engagement and support. So I'm super excited to do that. It's called Heartbeat. And this challenge is awesome. It's 28 days, if I do say so myself, but like the people in it are awesome too because it's an opportunity to learn more about your nervous system regulation. I share a short video each week, and then there's a practice video each week. You get a daily email to check in for accountability, see if you did something to regulate, so then I know if you're doing it, and you know I know, so it helps with accountability. And then there's a weekly check-in call, and people are finding it, if they're doing the work, are finding it really beneficial to help them regulate. To me, it seems like maybe timely to do this work. So if you're thinking, oh yeah, I need that, I've made it inexpensive. It's only $19.97, and if you're on my email list, if you're one of the or you sign up for the priority notification list because I may not have the next month available yet, the first 25 to register get 50% off. So you get it for $9.97, and I gotta tell you, I probably could sell this as a course for, like, at least $47, if not more. So this is a real deal, and if you've been in my space for any length of time, you know I over-deliver. Some because I care and I really wanna help people, and some because I just don't keep my mouth shut, and when someone asks me a question that's maybe not even in the scope, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, here, let me help you with that." So, just know I'm someone who does that, so you will definitely get your bang for your buck for your 1997, or if you're lucky enough to nab one of those coupons, from the priority notification list or my email list, then, $9.97 is a steal. So, anyway, check out the show notes. I'll share all that information, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.